My story begins with not a cliffhanger, but a boat hanger. So when I was 2 years old, we were initially trying to move southward from Da Nang to Saigon, and then Saigon was the path out of Vietnam. And in that moment, we were on a small boat and we pulled up to a freighter. So there's a huge difference in size, multiple stories. And what would happen is you would have to wait until the waves lifted the smaller boat up, and there would be a single thick docking line that sent down, and each individual had to jump, catch on it, and then climb up the rest of the way. Well, my family, you can imagine, I'm 2 years old. I'm not going to be able to do it by myself. At that point, my mother was planning to abort the trip, and a man next to her said, give the baby to me and I'll throw her to the deck. And she said no, but at that moment, my sister, who was 13 years old at the time, had already leapt, caught on the rope, climbed up herself. So we didn't want to be split up. So at that point, my mother turned to the stranger and said, "Okay, go ahead," and handed me over to him. He then waited for the boat to be lifted by another wave, threw me to the deck above, to yet another stranger who caught me by one chubby little hand, and we miraculously all survived. And I'll never forget that my brother describes these different escapes. Once you get onto the boat, to see a sea of floating black pants, which is what women in my tradition wore. And floating pants, of course, means that people unfortunately didn't make the jump. And at the time, my brother describes it as một mạng người không bằng một xu đỏ, which means that a life of a single person does not have the worth of a single red penny. And then from the barge to the 7th Fleet, which took us to the Philippines, in Subic Bay in the Philippines. From the Philippines, we go to Guam, and that's where the tent cities were set up. The tent cities at one point maxed out at 50,000 people, and when we left the barge, my brother was not allowed to come with us. So any males over the age of 16 were not allowed to come. It was women, children, elderly. So my brother was left behind. What was really remarkable was when we got to Guam, you can imagine the devastation that my parents must have felt, that they broke a promise to my father's parents, my mother's parents. She didn't even get to see them before we left. And then now they lost their oldest son somewhere amongst all the refugees. We get to Guam, and remarkably, my brother happened to see my father in the middle of the streets, and we were reunited. So we had so many moments that were harrowing, that were difficult, but there were so many other things where we have gratitude for. If you ask each family member, everyone has a different perspective and a different memory. My parents obviously were very conscious about, how do we survive in this new country with a new language. My younger siblings remember standing in queue for hours for food, excited with this large community. My oldest sister remembers we were housed in these barracks, these army barracks, and each barrack has maybe 20 families in it. And she remembers being upstairs, looking out the window, staring at the boy across the way in the other barrack that was staring back at her. And they have been together for 45 years and counting at this point. We ended up migrating a couple times within the US. and ended up in Louisiana. I grew up with Black and white teachers, Black and white friends, in a community of Asians. So I had the privilege actually of growing up with a lot of diversity and a lot of perspective. And I also happened to end up in schools where talent mattered. And it's one of those things where you don't appreciate the prejudices that people have or don't have until you lose it and you move into another environment where it's extremely prevalent. And it's quite shocking. It's quite shocking, really disappointing, but it teaches you how to adjust, and it teaches you how to be really scrappy and stand for your values. When I went to this new school, I was definitely the only Asian person at this moment. And in the mornings, I would be on a swing set, and I was definitely shunned. So I would try to occupy my time by just being on the swing set. And inevitably, I would get pushed off every morning. It just sucked. But you brush yourself off and you find another corner to sit in. And then in the afternoons, I would wait by the curb, and boys would bike by, and sometimes they would spit on me, and sometimes they would just yell names. And that was just life until one day, 7 girls decided to surround me, and they decided they were going to beat me up for no apparent reason. At this point, I decided to use their prejudices against them, and I'd watched enough Bruce Lee movies to know what a good horse stance looks like, and to know how to ground my body, how to raise my hands, to, at least fake it. Well, just having that confidence was enough, because I broke out of a stereotype. I leaned into a stereotype and broke out of it at the same time, meaning I leaned into the, all chinks no kung fu, but also I broke out of the meek Asian girl model. And so half of them went away automatically, and the other half, let's just say, I walked out just fine. There were no teachers around, and I was never bothered again the rest of the school year. Meritocracy worked for me for a while. I did very, very well early in career. And what I would find is towards middle career, when you're starting to move up, that's when meritocracy starts falling apart. And people like me are stubborn, and I refused to see that. I refused to admit it, because success was merely an equation of intelligence and diligence. If I'm not ascending in the way that I've always ascended, I must be doing something wrong. I had to realize that there were other factors, and I did what I could to network, to expand and stretch. But there were elements that I just had to realize that I was fighting 200 years of unconscious bias, and I had to stand up for myself. And I had to find advocates and allies to stand up for me. It was a big learning lesson, and it's made a really, really big difference. So my first experience would be when I left a long-time job. And what happens when you leave corporate and become an entrepreneurial, you really get to figure out who your friends are. And you really get to figure out who's going to put their necks on the line for you. And remarkably, who doesn't. I received recommendations from people I never expected. And it was people that I had done favors for or had conversations with never any intent of quote unquote using them as a network. But it just goes to show you that everyone's watching all the time. And if you come in with a good heart, with good intentions, it will lead the way. And because of these connections, I was able to replace my salary within the first 18 months, which is pretty astonishing for an entrepreneur. I just became really credible for what I do, known as an industry expert, specifically in sales enablement. Lo and behold, I've had a lot of recruitment from one company to another, from people who were just advocates. Hey, I spent a day with this person. As soon as a job opening came up that was interesting, they would think of me and say, I'm not the right fit for the job, but man, can I tell you someone who's really interesting? And they laid their reputations down for me. And I really, really appreciate that. I know I can always walk through the fire and typically emerge better. So I cannot control other people. I cannot control their thoughts, behaviors, intents, and actions. So if I go in with authenticity, vulnerability, the best of intentions to help the other side, what's interesting is it actually opens up the same in the other person. They want to receive that. We forget how lucky we are. And I would say that is the thing that irritates me the most, is when people don't use their voice and their choice. The phrase we use all the time in our household is first world problems. When you're feeling down, you think about what you have and what others don't. You really are working in the framework of first world problems. We always let gratitude guide our attitude. We treat everyone with respect because there's an opportunity to learn. I learn from my children every day. My children at this point are my peers. They know that the weight of their message carries as much as mine. They're also very aware, because they know the stories in my background, that ownership and accountability is really important, especially in sales, but true in life. Credibility is hard to earn, easy to lose, and even harder to recover, if ever.